The good news is that there are hundreds of people in small towns and rural communities around the country who are creating much better alternatives. Not just talking about it, not just pondering or writing, some of that, but mostly doing.
That's Anthony Flaccavento, this week's guest on Everywhere Radio. Everywhere Radio is a production of the Rural Assembly, and I'm your host, Whitney Kimball Coe. Each episode, I spotlight the good, scrappy, and joyful ways rural people and their allies are building a more inclusive nation. Before we get to Anthony, I'd like to talk about the Rural Assembly Everywhere virtual event that will be held May 10th and 11th. It's for rural advocates and the rural curious, listeners and leaders, neighbors and admirers. We'll enjoy 2 days of virtual programming featuring artists and poets, civic leaders, and experts. You can register for free at ruralassembly.org. Anthony Flaccavento is a farmer, author, and co-founder of the Rural-Urban Bridge Initiative, an organization that makes the case for repairing political, economic, and cultural divides across our country. Anthony is the son of immigrants who found their way to New York City and then Baltimore, and as a young adult, Anthony made his way to Appalachia, where he became an undergraduate at the University of Kentucky, studying agriculture and environmental science. He fell in love with the region and eventually put down roots in Southwest Virginia, where he continues to write, farm, and organize. Anthony is a passionate apologist and advocate for rural people, the land, and the power of local relationships to drive change. In 2018, he was the Democratic candidate for Congress for Virginia's 9th District, a district that is larger than the state of New Jersey, and his campaign was focused on building solidarity among Southwest Virginia's working and middle class, and promoting policies that honor the connection between ecological well-being and economic health. Anthony lost his 2018 bid, but continued to pursue his passion for building networks and opportunities for progressive political action. And he launched the Rural-Urban Bridge Initiative, nicknamed RUBI, with a host of partners and their members. RUBI develops strategies and trainings designed to encourage leaders, particularly those with a liberal or progressive bent, to think, act, and respond differently, to make the case for rural inclusion in progressive politics, and to champion the common interests of working and middle-class Americans. Anthony is the author of Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up, Harnessing Real-World Experience for Transformative Change. And his book has been used by practitioners, students, and academics across the country. So I'm really pleased to have Anthony here with us on Everywhere Radio. Thank you, Anthony, for saying yes to this conversation.
Oh, I did so very willingly, Whitney. Thanks.
Wonderful. I wondered if you could just start by telling me a little bit about your formation. I gave, a pretty lengthy, intro. But I want to know more about your journey to becoming an advocate for Appalachia and for rural populations.
Sure. I grew up in a pretty non-political family, kind of a lower middle class family in Baltimore. Great family, but nobody was really political. I found myself, the Italians would say, with agitas. I was really frustrated with the world that I began to learn about when I was a teenager and wanted to do something. And so for the first few years from high school, college, a little bit after college, I guess you could say I was driven by the desire to build a more just world. I thought, we had so much suffering, so much injustice and unfairness in the world. And so that's how I initially got involved, and there was a very strong church religious component to it as well. For a while, I worked for the Catholic Diocese in Southwest Virginia, directing their Office of Justice and Peace. And so all of that was probably my initial formation. What happened when I went to UK, the University of Kentucky, and then started working first for what was then called the Soil Conservation Service, now NRCS, and then I worked for an engineering firm doing strip mine reclamation, that was really my first immersion into Appalachia. We're talking now about the late 70s. So during that period, the late 70s, early 80s, I found myself working in Appalachia, didn't know a clue about it. Read Harry Caudle's book, Night Comes to the Cumberlands.
Next to the
Then
Cumberland. Yeah.
met Harry Caudle, which was a wonderful thing, and then started just doing other reading. But what I discovered was I had pretty much the typical prejudices about country people that city folks have. Sort of a sense that I wanted to help them because they were pathetic and couldn't help themselves. It was that. I mean, I hate to admit it, but it's true. That's where I was coming from initially. And it didn't take long at all, even just this strip mine reclamation job, which wasn't a job about politics or culture, to very quickly get that idea slammed by ordinary people who I found were both smart about things that really mattered and also very articulate in how they talked about it. Usually with about 5% of the words that I used, they were nailing things. So it kind of it turned me around a little bit. I started to see that it wasn't about coming into an area and helping people. It was about settling in an area, becoming a neighbor, and working with folks.
Well, I want you to say a little bit more about the stereotyping that happens to Appalachians and rural populations, and how that is shaped in your mind, politics and policy outcomes in where we live here in Appalachia.
Yeah, I mean, some of it is the way we have this two-tiered notion about education, and which is deeply ingrained in our country. It's not specifically rural versus urban, although it breaks out along those lines a lot. And it is that higher education is book learning. It's going to college. It's the academic framework, and that everything else is necessary, but a lesser form of education. And it's very prevalent, and it's the basis upon which people who have the opportunity for higher education quickly begin to think of themselves as being in a position of knowledge that people who don't have that book learning don't have. So it automatically sets up, I think, a power kind of dynamic that's terrible. I was on a call with somebody just a week or two ago, real smart person, talking about some political things. And at one point, we were talking about the fact that Democrats cluster in cities and Republicans are now more in rural areas. And he talked about being that people in the city, those were the places where there was a lot of well-educated people, and in the country there was lower education levels. And I said, well, not exactly. I said, I know a lot of people who haven't been to college who have deep understanding of issues that people in the city have no clue about. And I'm talking about like really weighty issues around food production and how the ecosystem works and the forests work. And a lot of the most knowledgeable, insightful people with real technical understanding never went to college for it. So it's reframing what it means to be educated. That's the first thing. And that's what my little aha was. I probably didn't call it that at that moment. It was like, dang, these folks know a lot of stuff. And I assumed that they
Mm-hmm.
probably didn't because they didn't have the advantage of higher education. So I think that's still permeates a lot of thinking from the left and just from educated people generally. And I find myself in all kinds of settings constantly fighting to say, don't just involve working folks and farmers and country people when you finish designing your programs that you now want them to implement. Get them at the outset designing the programs. Get them engaged at that conceptual level, that intellectual level, because without a doubt, the programs would be a whole lot better if that happened. So anyway, that's a long rant about it, but I really think that two-tiered view of education underlies, or at least it provides kind of the foundation for a lot of the other things that propel the divide.
Hmm. Can you tell me, give me some maybe more concrete examples of what your experience has been working with folks in this region and rural people as they're being brought into these programs or brainstorming places, or places where their expertise is being called in.
Mhm.
Um, how have you seen that played out in good
Oh
ways?
yeah, all kinds of ways. When we started Appalachian Sustainable Development back in 1995, by that point I had been in Southwest Virginia for 10 years, and we started to think about how do you build an economy that works better for people and better for the land, the environment. Nobody really knew. It hadn't been the normal way of building an economy up to that point. So we started talking to tobacco farmers about what was going on with them. This was the period when the tobacco allotments were shrinking, profitability was getting slimmer and slimmer, and so tobacco, which had been a kind of a core crop for a lot of small to mid-sized farmers, was on its way out. And we went and met with tobacco farmers in Lee County, in far southwest Virginia, in Scott County, a little bit over the border in Hawkins County, Tennessee, those kinds of places. And what we found was that rather than just kind of desperately holding on to tobacco until to the bitter end, which was kind of the approach that the land grants and extension were taking, sort of a nothing can replace tobacco mindset, we found a lot of farmers that were anxious to stay in farming, but to do something else. And these were not, hippie transplant farmers. These were born and raised folks from Lee County and other places. And so we worked with them to create this Appalachian Harvest Food Hub that's, I'm glad to say, still going 20 plus years later. But fundamentally, we had to work with them, and they then helped us figure out both the farming end. We brought some knowledge to it, and we did bring some of Virginia Tech and UT's resources, but it was really the farmers themselves. And then the marketing piece, which was critical.
No, that's great. And when you were running for District 9 as a Democratic candidate, I mean, I know you lost your bid, but you ran a really hard, good race. And I wonder what messages were you bringing to the fore as you did all those? I think you did like hundreds of town halls um, across that district. What messages were you bringing to the fore that you felt really resonated
Yeah, yeah.
with locals?
I appreciate that you said hundreds. It was actually about 102.
Oh,
Let's
okay.
let's just
Well,
round it up.
it's just
Let's round it
such a
up to
big district.
thousands.
Okay.
We did
But 100 is a
14,000 town
lot,
hall
man.
meetings.
Yeah. I bet it kind of felt like
Yeah,
that
it did. It did. But you know what?
sometimes.
Even though, again, yeah, all the context for my race is always that some things did work and did move the needle, but ultimately we lost pretty handily. But those town
Yeah.
halls were really quite something, and they were sort of a combination. I always pitched what I believed because I felt like if you get 50 or 200 people in a little community center in Meadows-Adan, they need to know who you are, what you stand for. But most of it was typically 90 minutes to 2 hours, and most of that was chatting. Most of that was me listening and then responding to questions. But in my little pitch in the town halls and the rest of the campaign, I always started with um, the fact that trickle down economics has failed, that trickle down don't, I would say, that in fact it's a suck up economy that pulls wealth out of farmers and family owned businesses and Main Street and community banks and all of that to an ever smaller group of ever larger corporations, whether they were the mega banks or the Tysons of the world. So that was always the starting point. We have this economic paradigm that Democrats and Republicans alike have embraced that simply has failed most Americans and has failed spectacularly in places like Appalachia and other predominantly rural areas. Then the second half of the message was the good news is that there are hundreds of people in small towns and rural communities around the country who are creating much better alternatives. Not just talking about it, not just pondering or writing, some of that, but mostly doing. And that these alternative, what I came to call in my book, bottom up economies, were real. They were leading to tangible improvements in people's lives. They were creating businesses and jobs. And that the big problem we had was that because we were so stuck on this elite-driven top-down, trickle-down, all those alternatives got the breadcrumbs. They got what fell off the table in terms of both investment and the right policy. And so that was the basic framing. The current
Mm-hmm.
paradigm, it isn't working. It's the opposite of what it says. And we have the foundation of experience and knowledge to build much better economies that work for people and work for the land. That was really the message. Now, of course, I ended up talking about all the issues, but that was the core. And it was remarkable how widely that resonated.
Mm. And even though, ultimately you lost that bid, there was some evidence there that that there is room for those kinds of conversations, and even progressive, maybe even some liberal politics and policy, that it can exist in a rural context. Um, I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, because I think it's kind of what drives a bit of the Rural Urban Bridge Initiative, the organization you've co-founded,
Absolutely.
that progressive politics actually, and policies actually do have a place in a rural context.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And the cool thing is when you start with real world examples, if I would talk about the experience with the tobacco farmers in the creation of Appalachian Harvest, or I would talk about what we did in sustainable forestry and wood flooring that came out of that, what happened in the home ownership program, it was really pretty small step from talking about that experience to talking about how policies either helped or hurt that kind of economy. Because most people, you'd get the occasional skeptic, but most people, regardless of their politics or even their education background, agreed with the critique. The trickle down hadn't, that it was sucking up, and that these other alternatives, which often they had not heard of, were really exciting to them. So then the question was, okay, what would you do as a congressperson to promote that? And then it was just these small steps to say, well, look what the current policy propels. Look what, for instance, economic development policy propels. So frequently on the campaign trail, I talked about how we spend about $100 billion a year, local, state, and federal, on tax incentives for the biggest corporations. We compete with each other. Southwest Virginia competes with Eastern Kentucky. Scott County competes with Tazewell County. And we offer these lucrative subsidy packages for corporations, some of whom turn out to be decent employers and long-term, but many of whom are transient, many of whom come and go after a few years. And I would talk about the example where Bristol recruited a Cabela's to come to exit 5 on Interstate 81 with an incentive package that was almost $50 million for one store to set up shop so they could create a cluster of stores and businesses around that. Meanwhile, the same leaders are trying to revitalize State Street in the downtown of Bristol and doing some things for it. But the day that the Cabela's deal was announced in the Bristol paper, this almost $50 million package, was the same day that at the back of the same issue of the Bristol paper, they announced the winner of the Entrepreneur of the Year award for downtown Bristol. And they described her business, and then they talked about what she got, $5,000. So you got 5,000 versus 50 million. That's a $10,000, 10,000-fold difference. And I would say to people, when we have policies like that, how could we possibly expect local independent businesses to compete, to thrive, when we're spending so much public money, your money, my money, to recruit businesses that are already cash rich and already have so many advantages? So it was always really very small, as I said, small step between talking about the examples, good and bad, and the kinds of policies that either helped or hurt.
Mm-hmm. And yet, how does I mean, that's such a powerful example, and, as a local rural person, if that were presented to me, I would just, be overwhelmed, um, at the difference between that $5,000 and the local entrepreneur and the Cabela's. I mean, how does it still get drowned out by single party politics? How are we still climbing this steep
Yeah.
hill, where single party politics is the driving force?
Right. Well, I think that the Republicans have been able to establish a kind of a one party rule in so many of our Appalachian counties and so many rural counties across the country. Again, in part because they talk a lot better than we do. They've got great one liners.
Mhm.
In part, I would say, putting on my somewhat negative partisan hat, they're willing to be extremely loose with the truth and say what they feel needs to be said. But turning it back on us, it's because we have not presented a consistent, compelling alternative. Plain and simple. We haven't. On the one hand, the Democratic Party on cultural issues has clearly become more liberal. And personally, I'm glad for that. But for conservative people in small towns, the cultural sorts of changes, what's now considered acceptable, normal, laudable, has shifted quite a bit, and it's a bit of a shock to a lot of people, the cultural changes. So the Democratic Party has, in fact, become quite a bit more liberal on those issues. But at the same time, they've become more neoliberal, for the most part, on economic issues. So it's a double whammy. The kind of disruptive or worrisome from some people's point of views shifts in our social and cultural norms are accompanied not by a similarly progressive economic platform, but by an economic platform that embraces investor-driven trade policy that's hollowed out rural communities, or big ag policies that have really almost destroyed thousands of ag-based communities because of the favoring of the big four in meat processing and the big fertilizer and seed companies and all of those things. It's not rocket science, but we keep struggling against this. And the fact that the Republican Party has gone so far to the right has only made it more difficult, because now Democrats are either trying to counter the extremism, which I understand, or they feel like they present a sort of, at least we're not crazy kind of definition of what it means to be a liberal or a Democrat. So people are given the choice: this guy who talks a good game but seems a little bit nutty, or these folks who say, hey, we're not as bad as them. What the heck kind of a choice is that?
We'll be right back after this from the Daily Yonder.
Hi, I'm Xander Brown with the Daily Yonder. Check out the Yonder Report, a new weekly podcast rounding up the latest rural news. Produced by the Daily Yonder and Public News Service, you can listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, back to Everywhere Radio. Well, is bridging the rural-urban divide mostly about better frameworks, better communication, different narratives, or is it what's the ratio between that and the doing and showing
Yeah.
what it looks like?
Yeah, I'm convinced that it has to be founded on the doing. So this is why, so RUBI, and thanks for that you did a terrific job explaining RUBI. I may quote you on it because I don't think I've been able to do it quite so well. But RUBI has these three initiatives. One around best practices of candidates who've done well in rural communities, which we can talk about if you want. One is our rural-urban divide training that we've done about 20 times now and keeps evolving, which really gets to the heart of how we got here and then what we can do. And then the third and kind of newest piece that we're in the process of launching is enabling local communities. Now, that might be the local Democratic Committee in many cases, but it could also be a local environmental group or social justice group, encouraging and enabling them to start engaging in a daily way, or a regular way, let's say, with their neighbors on solving problems in the community. Not proselytizing. That's something that they should also do when the time is right. Not writing postcards talking about how bad the other candidate is. All that stuff is, something people do and needs to be done. But we're talking about now, How many times have a local Democratic committee, as a Democratic committee, been seen out there rehabbing a home for an elderly person who needs a home repair or a new roof? How many times have the local liberal groups worked with the Chamber of Commerce and the Main Street Association to build up a buy local campaign or a farmers market support campaign? How many times have they focused on harnessing some of their resources to create scholarship possibilities for local kids to go to technical school, community college, or college? All of these kind of everyday things that should be done and can be done with other local groups, churches, Rotaries, Kiwanis, businesses. If if we begin to engage in that work as just part and parcel of what it means to be political in rural places, I think three things happen. One is good stuff gets done, right? Homes get rehabbed, senior centers get a new wing, downtown businesses do better. Second thing is we'll start to finally see our rural neighbors as our equals or betters in some cases. When you work side by side with somebody, the educational and cultural artifacts tend to slip away, and because you're both at the same level, whether you're swinging an axe or running a chainsaw or whatever you're doing. And then the third thing that we think will happen out of that is that those same liberals and progressives will start advocating for better rural development policy. They'll start advocating, like the Biden administration, and I was no Biden guy, I was a Bernie guy, but they have, for all their flaws, they have put forward several really substantive initiatives for rural, including the Rural Prosperity Program, which started out as a $5 billion initiative. It's been whittled down to $1 billion, but still a really good bottom-up approach to rural development. Well, anyway, most liberals don't know the first thing about it and probably wouldn't be interested if they heard the name. But you start working in your community and identifying the problems and the solutions, I think you're going to become advocates for the right kind of policy.
I mean, I feel like I'm 100% with you. The practice of participation, engagement, uh, building relationships with your neighbors, showing up in daily, common ways, um, builds that trust over time, and that change moves at the pace of trust and relationship. And but I also want to just say, I mean, is it working anywhere? Do you see this playing demonstrated, and that this is working, or is this just a really long term strategy for building communities?
Yeah, it is a very long-term strategy. So it is working in the sense that a few of in most cases, it's been local Democratic committees that have gone through the rural-urban divide training we provide. A
Mhm.
few of them have actually started to implement some of these things. And they're really excited about it. It's kind of a new direction, a new focus. They recognize that what they've done up to this point has not made a difference. They're not making headway. So there's a lot of energy behind it. Now, is it going to add up to a different view of what liberals, progressives, and Democrats are? We don't know. But our project is this, that we're going to, if we can get the support, we're going to set this up in 8 different local communities in 4 different states, do a poll before we get going in all of those communities to see what the current view is of liberals, progressives, Democrats, and then probably do a poll midway through, but after 2 years, do another poll to see if anything has moved. Now, we think it will take a good bit more than 2 years to really see the results, because people who highly mistrust you are not going to change their perspective overnight. But our hope is that in 2 years we'll see enough movement that the major liberal and progressive organizations will decide this is a strategy worth adopting and join us in doing it on a much larger scale than these 8 pilot communities.
We haven't really gotten a chance to talk about you personally and your own experience in, planting roots where you have, and the farming that you do, and the writing, and the your own practice of participation. in your community. And I wonder if you want to say anything about those things, about how your own life is informing the work you're doing day to day.
Well, I mean, it is in the sense of what I said at the beginning, that you're when you farm, you're constantly humbled, because although
Mm,
you accumulate knowledge and skill, you're also regularly shown what you don't know. My friend Tom Peterson, who started farming in Southwest Virginia just a few years after me, we ran into each other a couple of summers back when it was a particularly difficult time in the season. And he said to me, "Do you ever think that the longer you farm, the less competent you are?" And I said, "Yeah, buddy." So farming is such, I mean, it's so enriching. And for me, it's very much, you got to use your brain, but you're also using your body so much that it's a tremendous relief from all the work I do that is kind of people oriented. And
mhm.
I'd lose my mind if I couldn't farm. If I couldn't get in the dirt and get out the chainsaw and all that stuff, I couldn't handle it. But what's happening is that I not only learned from farming, but all of that farming activity and all of the kind of local economy work that we've done here, but I do it all around the country. It's just constantly surfacing new ideas. People are doing new things that are strengthening local economies, rebuilding community, tackling health and healthcare in a new way. And so there's just this steady upwelling of new information and new insights. And that then feeds back into the training that RUBI does, that feeds back into the rural development policy piece of where we need to be there. So yeah, I think it's a dance back and forth pretty much all the time.
Mm. Well, Anthony, one of the questions I always ask my guests is, what are you reading or listening to or watching that you would commend to our audience that you think we ought to be paying attention to right now?
Sure. So on the RUBI website, we have the guidebook that we've created, which is a bunch of articles that dive into this subject in a relatively concise way. And we have a list of books. So there's some really, really fine books if you want to understand this. Two or three that I would highly recommend. One is Kathy Kramer's book. She's in Wisconsin. Fantastic human being. Kathy wrote a book called The Politics of Resentment, where she spent 3 or 4 years visiting with people in like 2 dozen different rural communities in Wisconsin to try to understand the rise of Scott Walker. It's incredibly uh, pertinent for the larger kind of rise of Trump and whatnot. Brilliant book, Politics of Resentment. Second one is Erica Edelson's book, Beyond Contempt: How Liberals Can Communicate Across the Great Divide. Just nailing it in so many ways about how our language alienates people and how we can begin to turn that around. And Erica's a core part of RUBI. Fabulous book. And then a recent one that I just finished. Let me see if I can remember the author's name. The author is from the New York Times editorial board, a very highly educated, very liberal African American woman who took a year or two to meet with people in uh, basically a Rust Belt town that was losing its major manufacturing employees. It's called American Made. And I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the author's name, but it's called American Made. This just came out earlier this year or last year. And again, what's so good about that book is it's somebody who came to the issue and came to these conversations with white and black workers at these factories with pretty much the liberal, if not bias, at least construct. And it was challenged constantly, and she really reformulated her view of working class and rural people. So that's excellent as well. I
Hmm.
don't I
Well, I have
don't
the
read for pleasure. So my son
oh,
30 years ago, when my son Josh was like 10 years old, He said, "Dad only reads things that add to his sense of moral outrage." That's not really true, but I do read more for kind of learning than I do for pleasure, I'm afraid.
Yeah. What was the word that you brought up at the beginning of our conversation? An Italian word
Oh,
that described.
yeah. Agita.
Uh, yes. Yeah. So
Yeah, I got way too much of
that.
that.
Okay. Well, that book you were just mentioning, American Made, I have the benefit of being able to sit in front of a computer right now, and it's by Farah Stockman.
Yes, that's it. Thank
Is that right? Yeah.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. We covered a little bit in a big sea of topics. So I would love to have you back, and I'd love to keep talking to you about what you're learning on this journey.
Yeah, that would be terrific. And, in another 4-6 months, that candidate assessment will be out and we'll be further down the road. So maybe we can talk again then.
That'd be great. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, Whitney.
That's all for this week's show. I want to remind you to register for the Rural Assembly Everywhere virtual gathering that will be held May 10th and 11th. It's for rural advocates and the rural curious, listeners and leaders, neighbors and admirers. We'll enjoy 2 days of virtual programming featuring artists and poets, civic leaders, and experts. You can register for free at ruralassembly.org. If you enjoyed Everywhere Radio, we'd love for you to consider subscribing to the General Rural Assembly newsletter. That's where we promote new offerings from the Assembly and we amplify the good work of our many partners across the country. We've also launched a new policy advocacy newsletter that comes to inboxes on Mondays to help you start each week with a quick take on the top issues that we're tracking across the nation. Everything from broadband policy to rural vaccinations. Just head over to ruralassembly.org to sign up. If you're a true fan of Everywhere Radio, please let us know by rating us wherever you get your podcast. If this isn't your cup of tea, that's no biggie. It's fine. And we'd like to thank our media partner, the Daily Yonder. Everywhere Radio is a production of the Rural Assembly. Our senior producer is Joel Cohen, and our associate producers are Xander Brown and Teresa Collins. And we're grateful for the love and support of the whole team at the Center for Rural Strategies. Love you, mean it. You can be anywhere, we'll be everywhere.